and then we go on to the questions.
You got it.
Okay. All right. So, welcome everyone. I'm so glad that you all can join us for a lively discussion on investment crowdfunding and Black women legal representation, or I should say, securities law and Black women legal representation. And I'm the managing attorney of the law firm Elizabeth L. Carter Esquire LLC, which is also the host of this interview series, which is entitled "Democratizing the Securities Legal Space" with sponsorship by Law of Economic Democracy. We will have a Q&A portion. We ask that everyone reserve your questions towards the end, but you can also put them in the chat box there on the side, and then we can get to them. So any question you have for Renee or anything that was said on this interview, that will be said on this interview, please feel free to ask the question there. We'll also have information for you to follow up with myself and also Renee at the end. So the purpose of this interview series is to expose the general public as well as law students of color, especially Black women law students, to the various opportunities that exist within the field of securities law. And why this is important that we're specifically highlighting Black women is because Black women are also the fastest growing group of entrepreneurs and yet the least likely to have access to funding or other resources necessary for business growth and sustainability, including legal support. So therefore, it's important that these businesses have access to legal representation that is both representative and culturally sensitive to their unique funding challenges. So for this third installment, we would like to introduce Renee Hatcher. She's the Assistant Professor of Law and Director of the Community Enterprise and Solidarity Economy Clinic at University of Illinois Chicago John Marshall Law School. Renee is also a human rights and community development lawyer. She has served as staff attorney and project director for the Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, where she directed a community development law project providing legal services to entrepreneurs, community-based organizations, and individuals interested in expunging their criminal history to better opportunities for local marginalized communities. So welcome, Renee. Glad to have you here.
I'm so glad to be here. I'm so glad to, to be in conversation with you, Elizabeth, on particularly on this topic, right? And I love the intro the way you frame the issue. In part because, in my work as well, I'm seeing more and more Black women who are looking to start businesses or organizations, and also how important it is to, provide them with adequate, not only funding, but legal representation overall.
Exactly, most definitely. And then also, I think, there were some statistics rolling around about Black lawyers being only representing about 5% of the lawyer base, and then Black women less than 2%. So definitely the representation and the diversity is needed. So yeah, so thank you again. So we could just jump right into it. You've done a number of things, and like I tell people, I'm always admire you. I know we're not far apart in age or et cetera, but to me, I look up to you. So I love, and I want everyone else to see why. I mean, you're just dynamic. You're just, all around. You really are serious about what you do, serious about the community, and then you also able to, bring these different, somewhat different industries like business and community, work together. So let's explain how, I guess, how you're doing that with the clinic, and how have you done it in the past, and what makes the clinic different.
Yeah, so that's a big question. But no, so I feel the same way, right? And I feel very fortunate to have a lot of I feel like maybe a small critical mass, right, of peer mentors, as I see it, like in
I
terms
like that.
of the work that we're all doing, and it keeps me inspired too, and it continues to push my thinking. So in terms of, I assume everybody knows what a law clinic is, but just in case they don't, right? Essentially, a law clinic is like a program that's attached to most law schools where there's an actual practice of law that's happening. Typically, it's in furtherance of pro bono work or clients who do not have access or cannot afford an attorney. So my clinic in particular, as Elizabeth said, I'm a professor at the UIC John Marshall Law School, and I direct a clinic there called the Community Enterprise and Solidarity Economy Clinic. I've been doing this work. I've been doing clinical teaching, I guess, for about 6 years now, but I've been directing this particular clinic for about 3 years. When I first came on, it was actually called the Business Enterprise Law Clinic. And I'll say why I thought it was important to do a rebranding and change the name. But, as you kind of alluded to, my background, I guess, is one, there aren't that many of us who do community kind of transactional work, right? I feel like there's a few organizations that have practices around the country that do this kind of work. I certainly didn't know that this was the kind of work that I was going to do, but also, in hindsight, see how I kind of got into this and like the questions that I was trying to really figure out and trying to really think through what I could do with my law degree, with my legal skills, and furtherance of community and furtherance of like the things that I cared about, the communities that I cared about. And so I started doing community development law at the Chicago Lawyers Committee. They have a project there called the Law Project, now called the Community Development Law Project, or the Community Law Project. And originally that work was like limited, working with entrepreneurs, working with nonprofit organizations, mostly around startup issues, as well as, um, more established organizations or businesses that might need additional, support either around reviewing drafting contracts, helping them navigate different regulations. So I started doing that work in my practice when I first started. And I think the way in which I kind of came to doing the work that I do now, or the framing of the work I do now, is in part just like doing work, reflecting upon it, figuring out like, okay, is this actually, what kind of impact is this? Or is my approach and is the theory that's underlying the practice that I'm actually doing in furtherance of what I want to contribute to, but also like, am I working with the groups that I want to work with? Am I working with the clients really that I think are having such a really fantastic like impact and really amazing envisioning of what's possible in terms of community development, in terms of
Mhm.
actually giving more regular folks, residents, agency over their lives, over their neighborhoods, in terms of what economic development looks like, or what
Mhm.
services or products they need access to. And so it really was a process for me in terms of just like doing work, trying to take time and space to reflect on it and thinking about how I could be doing it differently, or how maybe my approach should be different. Um, and to me, like that's in part what community lawyering is, like trying to really assess and be connected to the needs of community, and then also like basically being intentional about developing your competencies and your programming around right what the needs are of community. And so like that's kind of just how I see the practice.
Mm.
And so that's more or less like how I came to reframe the clinic. I was someone who was interested and supportive of cooperative development, probably, I don't know, I think I got into it maybe like 2012, 2013. There were a couple of interesting projects or like things that I was doing and thinking about collective ownership. I had worked with a couple of community coalitions around development projects around community benefit agreements, and thinking about different ways to allow collectives either to own or to access right different rights or benefits. And so some of that kind of came out of that, but by and large, the clinic is an opportunity for us to provide services really in furtherance of self-determination of community residents on a local level here in Chicago, right? So thinking about and really trying to prioritize those clients again that can't access or can't afford legal services, but also are thinking about collective action, collective ownership, addressing things like work exploitation, wage theft, in part because they're starting their own co-ops, or they're interested in figuring out how they can own land together and leverage that for the benefit of the overall community. So that's in part what we do. I say simply put, like we provide legal support in furtherance of self-determination of local communities. We primarily, our clients are located on the South and West sides. We work mostly with Black and Latinx communities, on co-ops and other different kinds of community-based enterprises and organizations.
Awesome. Thank you. And you mentioned co-ops, just for people who may not know what a co-op is. What is a cooperative? How will you define it? Like, what is some of your clients? Like, how do they look like?
Yeah, I mean, so there are different types of co-ops, right? Like a lot of our practice focuses on worker co-ops, which is simply a business or enterprise that is owned and controlled by the workers themselves, right? And what that obviously that allows people to benefit from their own labor. It allows people to set the conditions of their work. It allows for a certain type of practice of economic democracy, right, at the workplace. But a lot of, I mean, it's also very practical. A lot of our clients are trying to address social issues, either that they've experienced or For example, I mentioned, a couple of our clients directly came out of experiences of work exploitation or wage theft, and then decided to start a worker co-op. But there are also different kinds of co-ops, like housing co-ops and consumer co-ops and producer co-ops. And we also service all of those types of co-ops as well. But just simply put, a co-op is a business that basically works for the benefit of its members. And so members can be different kinds of stakeholders in the business. It can be the people, for example, that are purchasing things. So that's what we would typically think of as a consumer co-op. So one just like very simple example of that is like co-op grocery stores. So maybe folks are familiar with a co-op grocery store in their city or their neighborhood, right? And so based off of the amount of business or the amount of groceries that you purchase from that co-op as a member, you receive a return on your investment, whether that's through, you know, um, um, credit to purchase future groceries, or if it's an actual like dividend that's paid out to members or whatever that looks like. But essentially, the grocery store provides products at sometimes lower rates, but ultimately like for the benefit of their members, and it's owned and typically controlled by their members. And so for a worker co-op, again, as I mentioned, it's like workers that are owning and controlling the business. So the workers themselves also often will receive dividends to the extent that, the business is profitable. Producers, so sometimes, it's easier to think of it as agricultural or farmers who are producing crops, and then perhaps they use the co-op, they form a co-op to get all of their product to market, or to take literally their crops to the farmers market to actually sell it, or they market it together. We also see a lot of producer co-ops around the artist space. So we work with a couple of artist collectives that kind of fashion themselves as producer co-ops. And then, more and more folks are interested in, and we've worked with a number of multi-stakeholder co-ops, which, can vary, but basically it means that different stakeholders in the co-op own and have at least some kind of say in the co-op itself. So, ultimately, co-ops, I think, are a way in which to democratize, right, economic institutions, to give people more agency and control over institutions, whether they be, and it can lend itself both to the for-profit and nonprofit context. But we see it as a way in which people are organizing and usually trying to either solve problems in their own neighborhoods, whether it's like meaningful work where they know they won't be exploited, or if it's actually the co-op itself is providing a service or a product that's really needed and not necessarily accessible in that particular neighborhood.
Right. Okay. Awesome. And I mean, in light of, so it sounds like cooperatives obviously have so much more to offer than a financial benefit. I mean, there's social, there's community. How do
Mhm.
you see their roles playing out well, during COVID, especially with the financial crisis, and then also post COVID? Like how will cooperatives help in these instances?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different ways in which that that is happening, that could continue to happen, that we can encourage and support like co-ops to really create the kind of infrastructure that we need, right? In part,
Hmm.
and so many of the issues that COVID has exposed. But at least for speaking for myself, like one of the things that I've seen is just an increase in mutual aid, right? So we have had co-ops that already exist who are now thinking about mutual aid efforts in the wake of COVID. And for example, like there's a food delivery service co-op that we work with that also started to think about how many meals they were able to donate in the wake of COVID, or to the extent that people can actually get out of the house, in part because they might be parts of vulnerable populations and really need to take care, how they could deliver those meals. I mean, we've seen even nonprofit organizations that do different kind of programming start to do mutual aid efforts and need support around that. But more broadly, I mean, I think there's a lot of opportunity right now. And like, I think we have to really move very quickly to make sure that we come out of this pandemic stronger. We know that 1 in 5 businesses have already closed or folded in the wake of the pandemic and the shutdown, that Black and brown businesses are most affected. And also, that there's a great loss of wealth when these businesses close, in part because a number of entrepreneurs, whether they be sole entrepreneurs or collectives or partnerships, that people invest a lot in their business and that they've lost a lot, just in terms of trying to weather the storm around the pandemic and the shutdown orders that they've had to endure.
Right.
So I think co-ops are a way for us to think about solutions out of the pandemic, right? So in thinking, there have been some, policy initiatives around trying to structure and provide technical assistance support to transition businesses that might be closing maybe to their workers,
Mhm,
in like a
mhm,
structured kind of buyout, or conversion to worker co-ops, and thinking about the technical assistance support and financial support that needs to go along with that to make those kinds of policy initiatives successful.
mhm.
But then I think more broadly, I think it COVID kind of exposed the ways in which we need to change the economy fundamentally to ensure that people actually have access to what they need, right? Like, so in thinking
Mhm.
about collective ownership, right? Thinking about housing opportunities, we know that the eviction crisis is here, that people are really in a bad way, and that a lot of folks might not be able to make November's rent, that, we need both organizing to cancel the rent, but also we need new forms of housing ownership, collective ownership, to actually make sure that we take speculation out of housing, to allow for more quality, affordable access to housing, because we have a crisis at this point, given where everything is at. So, you think about things like housing, you think about just the basic necessities that people need around food, or the economy more broadly. Like, fundamentally, we are at what always probably seems like a turning point, but right now I think the pandemic and this last year has really exposed the failure of so many of our institutions, but also how we've structured the economy more broadly. And I think co-ops are a way in which we can start to transform the economy to actually provide for people's basic needs at the very least.
Right. So in your clinic, it's called Community Enterprise and Solidarity Economy Clinic. How do you define solidarity economy, and how does it differ from a community enterprise or even a cooperative?
Yeah, so we like to think of community enterprises like as a community-based business, and that can mean different things. But by and large, it's for-profit enterprises that are connected to community in different ways, and that might mean things like collective ownership, or that might mean things like folks who are even sole owners who are very see themselves as responsible or responsive and accountable to community. I mean, we have like some really wonderful kind of community engaged for-profit enterprises, small businesses here in Chicago. The Silver Room is one that comes to mind immediately, only because they engage in different kinds of community events, and they also offer their space, for example, for different kind of organizational meetings, and run a number of initiatives throughout the year, and see themselves as more of you know, a citizen, like a business that is going to be a part and engaged in the needs of community. But more broadly, like the solidarity economy, one of the reasons why I thought it was important to include that language is that's, at least in part, since I've taken over this clinic, how I think about prioritizing clients. Like, so thinking about the solidarity economy as a way in which to prioritize the actual cases that we're taking, or the clients that we're taking on. And so, simply put, I see the solidarity economy as, I mean, it's both a movement, but at the core, it's really about creating both local and global economies that serve the needs of people and the planet, as opposed to the profit margin, and increasing the wealth of a small number of individuals who own the means of production, right? And
Right.
so in thinking about that, like we kind of use the different principles of solidarity economy, to prioritize like one client over the other. So thinking about clients that are going to have more of an impact. Think about, we have number of clients who are particularly trying to solve environmental issues. We have a number of clients who are maybe either for profit or nonprofit, but really are trying to speak to racial justice, economic justice, trying to make systemic change, or around the process of economic development, which is something that we kind of see ourselves engaged in more broadly. And so more or less like the solidarity economy, again, simply put, is a way in which to think about transforming the economy to one that actually centers the needs of people and community and our limited resources on this planet, and addressing things like, the climate crisis that is here, and trying to figure out how we can provide legal support in furtherance of that goal.
Right. So this, wow. I mean, so as far as you being a clinical director and doing this within the law school space, I mean, what are some of the, I guess, pros to doing it through the law school, particularly because these are complex, legal issue, and you say transforming, like assisting with the economic development space, and how do you do that with law students, and what are some of the challenges that you have?
Yeah, so what are the pros? I mean, as someone who's come out of the legal services space,
Hmm.
some of the advantages of working out of a law school is like, not necessarily having to engage constantly in fundraising, which is like one of the things, at least for me, right? It is, I mean, it is different in that way. And that also depends, right? To a certain extent, depends on maybe what kind of clinical program you're in.
Hmm.
But two, it also, running a clinic allows for a certain type of discretion. Like I can at least set our priorities and have more control over, again, like our case selection. We don't necessarily have maybe some of the types of restrictions that you might at another legal services organization. Beyond that, like it also allows me to engage in the theory of some of the practice of what we're doing, right? So thinking, being able to engage in conferences and folks who are thinking about like transforming local economies, the political economy, being able to at least have some time and space to think about it. I think there are a number of challenges, right? So working with law students, right, exposing them to these ideas, which in some ways are counter to legal education, the structure of legal education, like period, right? So when you think about, for example, the core first year courses and law school generally, legal education, I mean, in many ways it was set up to further protect and reinforce the status quo, and really to get folks who can kind of in some ways, control like the rules of the road as it relates to capitalism, right? Like, so when you think about what you're talking, contracts, or when you think about what you're talking, certainly in property, or like more broadly just the education, I mean, in part, right, legal education is all about reinforcing the status quo, the structure of the economy, the structure of our society in so many ways. And so, that presents a number of interesting challenges, in introducing students to new ideas about different ways that folks are thinking about economic development or community development, or how they want to reorder and restructure society or their own organization. And so, in some ways, like I see our clients, and more broadly like businesses, organizations, as kind of like, the units of the economy, like so within the economy, and thinking about, like the micro sort of neighborhood level of what the economy looks like, right? Our businesses are ways in which to start, with the building blocks, and transform those. And again, like this, a lot of this work, so much of, certainly, I think my inspiration, the work itself, is like driven by the clients and the things that people are imagining and reimagining what's possible. um, but yeah, it brings up interesting conversations, and I, try to structure a learning experience for the students, one, so they understand the context of our clients, so that it's not just, the kind of cookie cutter, oh, they need an operating agreement, this is easy, let me go find a template sort of approach, right? But really getting them to think about sometimes the challenges that our clients face, the systems that they have to interact with, the obstacles that they
Mm,
might face, but more so their perspective, their principles, their values, and how do we embed that into their institution, their organization, in ways that, are aligned with what they're trying to accomplish overall. So I mean, it's fun. I mean, the
mhm.
teaching aspect I really enjoy, but it also, it brings up different kinds of challenges. And it's not to say there's always space for, dissent and pushback. But always really love that moment in the semester or at the end of the school year when I can tell that at the very least the student has grown quite a bit just in their own lawyering skills and competencies, but also that they've been exposed to new ideas and new ways of thinking and doing things.
Right, right. And so this interview series called Democratizing the Security Legal Space. So how does securities law intersect with your work at the clinic?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, a number of our clients, both startups and established clients, like so we have certainly had and have securities issues come up all the time for clients that are looking to
Hmm.
raise capital, maybe at the outset, or clients who are interested, for example, just in understanding like how they could perhaps incorporate crowdfunding strategies, what are the best ways in which for them to structure based off of their financing plan in terms of their business. We've had clients, for example, that have also wanted to expand their operations and need to raise new capital and trying to navigate through the different securities laws that they need to, or find qualifying exemptions based off of what they're doing and the structure of what they're offering, the securities that they're offering. And it's also come up in policy ways. This clinic was involved with the drafting of the new limited worker cooperative association here in the state of Illinois. And one of the things that was really important for folks in putting that together and thinking about what a worker co-op entity should look like in the state of Illinois was the securities piece. So really thinking about how can we extend a securities exemption specifically for worker co-ops, particularly when they're looking for small amounts of capital from community investors, from community members who are not necessarily going to be qualified investors. And
Mhm.
so, securities issues, I think, is something that comes up a lot. Like, of course, especially if our clients are startups, we're going to be at least thinking through their different financing, plans and strategies, and how that ties into our counseling and the work that we're doing for them.
Right. I mean, it just sounds like there's so many different ways to support these businesses. And as a law student, I only can imagine the type of experience that they're getting and the quality experience that they're getting. Would you say is I mean, because it's still through the law school, right? And how important do you think that is necessary, or how necessary do you think that Black women are in the solidarity economy space, including, these crowdfunding securities, legal compliance measures?
hmm I think so, and maybe I would expand it to community development law. I will tell you, so I remember when I first started practicing, and you know, I think it's so important to have folks who are steeped in the communities that they're working with and that or have similar experiences, right? In part because we talk, I think we kind of throw around the term of cultural competency, but I think in part and um, and really in thinking about what the best of this work might look like is kind of giving communities the tools they need so that they can solve their own problems, right? And so, I mean, I feel like part of it is about the approach, but part of it also is about ensuring that folks that are actually in these organizations or who are on the ground and are the ones who are closest to the problems and the ones who um, should be articulating what the problems are and what the solutions are, like really trying to put these tools in their hands and ensuring that they have both the support and the capacity that they need to be able to create and to establish what they're trying to accomplish with their goals. And so I see, obviously, I see part of that as like ensuring that folks that are from these communities and that work in these organizations, right, also have access to legal skills. So I think that's a big piece of it. I mean, obviously, you mentioned that Black women are the fastest growing demographic in terms of entrepreneurs, right? And so, in part, like trying to ensure that we are also training up Black women to be able to provide, excellent legal services to those entrepreneurs, I think is really important. And I talk to the students sometimes about like the different ways of knowing, or the different ways in which you can gain knowledge, and life experience or the lived experience being one of them. And in part, I think that's why it's so important. I've worked in legal services organization where it feels like a very top down approach, or the
Mhm.
solutions, the service itself seems very disconnected from the people that you say you're working with, or the clients. And that, more than anything, I think is problematic. And I think that we need folks who are actually from the communities that they're working in to be more connected, be folks who can, and articulating and collaborating with um, the clients in a different way. And in some ways also restructuring some of these organizations that are doing the work.
Right. And so, and although be clear that, your students are coming from the law school base, and we already know that law school is not as diverse as we like it to be. But
Mhm.
like, what is the representation of people, students of color in your clinic? And then also, do you think that this is an attractive sort of, it's one thing to say, okay, we have to train Black women lawyers or Black women law students, but what is the attractiveness for them to want to get into the space? So I guess two questions. One, what is the, racial representation, or the of people, of students of color? And then also, what do you think is needed to attract more Black women in this space?
Yeah, those are really great questions. So from semester to semester, it varies. In my clinic, in terms of like the amount of or percentage of students of color, or Black Latinx representation in the law school, I will say that UIC John Marshall is typically ranked towards the top in terms of the
Okay.
most diverse law schools. But again,
Okay.
that's like comparing relatively to other
Yeah.
law schools, which is a low
Mhm.
bar, right? And it's hard for me, like, why would Black women lawyers be attracted to this field? I mean, I can speak to why I initially was got into this work, and why I enjoy this work. um I mean, in part, I think also it was a result of me trying to figure out my own experiences, and trying to figure out the world around me, and okay, well, what is the work that I'm going to do? But also, okay, I'm from Gary, Indiana. Why is it that I know that this was a bustling city, that this was somewhere that folks in Chicago used to vacation to, that we had a vibrant downtown, we had a vibrant social, civil, community here. And now, when I'm growing up, half of the city is like almost abandoned. And trying to make sense of that, or why is like all the commercial activity gone? Why are these roads not updated? Like, why is there so much disinvestment and neglect in a city like Gary? And I mean, and that's a lot of, I think, our experiences, like folks who grew up in the Black community, right? Like in post-industrial, thinking about how globalization like hit Black, middle working class communities and families hard,
Mm.
and our cities hard. So you think about places, Detroit and Baltimore, and obviously Gary, and I mean, like these cities who were primarily Black. Newark, of course, right? And so much of that, right, is based off of how economic development currently works. It's based off of how both large corporations come in, and in some ways siphon off our resources, and then leave when they either decide to move to a country where they think that they can exploit the labor force more, or maybe they'll get more tax breaks from the next city that they decide to move to. And so, like, that's a lot of what I was really trying to figure out, like that process, and like why my city, like my experience was the way it was growing up. And then how can I change that? And we all I think have either had experiences or know folks, and I'm talking about like folks in the Black community in this country, like we've all known folks who have gotten pushed out based off of gentrification, or we've been priced out of our own neighborhoods, or we see the way that economic development always confers the most burdens on the Black community or communities of color, and we never benefit off of development in ways that are tangible, right? So even in terms of work, you see places like Walmart come in and pay, very low wages. You see how they've treated women, for example. You see like it's just like the ways of the rules of the economic system don't work for Black folks. And this country more broadly, right, was built off of free Black labor, right? The enslavement of Black folks. And so much of that meant something to me and trying to figure that out. And that's one of the reasons why I was inspired to try to do this work and really think about what's possible beyond what exists. The other thing that I'll say is like one of the reasons why I really love transactional work is in part because your relationship with your client is different. What you're doing essentially is like working towards a goal, like you're collaborating in a different way with your client.
Mm-hmm.
You're working towards a goal as opposed to trying to redress a harm that has happened. And I know, when I first started, I was doing like employment discrimination, and I'd done a couple of prisoners' rights cases, and it like that experience and that feeling, but also just the knowledge of like what the legal system looks like, it was very clear to me that the legal system is not sufficient to address the actual harms that often happen to our clients, particularly those who have experienced discrimination. And
Mm-hmm.
what I mean by that is like, even for example, to the extent that you successfully resolve a case or a client gets a favorable settlement as a result of the discrimination that they've experienced, it still does nothing to address like the harm, the mental fatigue, the physical harm, a lot of times that comes to clients by going through the experience of discrimination. And so, I enjoy the transactional work so much more because we're building towards something different. We're building institutions where collaborating with our clients in a different way and trying to think about what's possible as opposed to trying to redress harms with a very limited toolbox, which
Mm-hmm.
is the legal system. So, those are some of the reasons why I really am drawn to this work and tend to enjoy it so much. And particularly like getting to do community development work, like work with community orgs and folks who are really trying to think about like local issues and how we can redress those in ways that are actually ways that are articulated by the community.
Right. Thank you. I mean, and I would say even my own personal sort of journey to this space. When I was in law school, I didn't know. When I heard corporate, I took business associations primarily because I knew I wanted to do community transactional, right? I
Mhm.
knew early that I didn't want to do litigation. I knew I wanted to do urban planning and something with community development and built environment. But so I listened to the part that talked about nonprofits and business associations, but anything beyond that, I was like, it's not for me. It's not for my community. It's for big corporations. But now looking back, if I had an understanding that securities law could be applied to community development law, or even just or complex business, transactions can be applied to the community, even real estate and all these other things. It's like I had to sort of work my way through the process just through internship, through experience, just trial and error.
Mhm.
How is it that we can sort of introduce this to law students so much earlier on? Not to say the journey is the journey. I mean, I appreciate the journey, but maybe we could cut out we could cut out a lot of stuff if folks knew early on, this is what I want to do and this is why. Connecting finance and business to community, I think oftentimes it's not connected.
Yeah, I think that's why. Um, I mean, to me, that question begs the question of like how we need to think differently about legal education, right? So, but also the kinds of institutions that we're building, the kinds of opportunities, for example, for internships or those early experiences that expose students or law students, future lawyers to this work.
Hmm.
So I think there's actually like real work that we could do around building out just the legal service infrastructure around some of this work because again, as I said, there aren't that many organizations that do this work. There's many more clinics. They might take a different orientation, but that do some kind of transactional work. But so for example, one of the things that in addition to the clinic, I also teach business associations, and so I thought really hard about how to teach it in such a way that exposes students to not just like, okay, this is a corporation and like the basic principles and tenets
Right.
of corporate law, but also, what's once a lot of the things that are always excluded in those courses. So, we do not just talk about nonprofit corporations, but we talk about alternative and social enterprise. We talk about like benefit corporations and L3Cs and cooperative corporations or LWCAs and like kind of the alternative kind of suite of entity options. But then, also connecting it to the regulations for corporations. We talk about, corporate social responsibility. We talk about like capitalism, which some of my students enjoy, others do not. They're like, just teach me what I need to know for the bar. So, I mean, but we have conversations about like capitalism versus socialism, but thinking about, again, like corporations in part is like teaching them the building blocks of how to reinforce and maintain what is the current economic systems. And so we talk about some of the issues with that. We talk about the Enron scandal, right? So giving them like concrete examples. And when I do hypos, they aren't just like your normal hypo, but we talk, it might be a certain twist, or it might go beyond, I think, at least what might be just the normal experience in business associations. So there are lots of ways I think that it could happen. I think what we do need though too is like more folks who are, I think we need to think more broadly and about the ways in which legal education should be transformed, but also we need, more folks who are in academia. I mean, I think that's one of the benefits of
Mm,
maybe being in academia is that you can really about the training of future lawyers. And I know certainly in my experience, even the way that we talked or did not talk about race and the way in which race and racism is embedded in the law, right? It's a problem.
mm,
It's definitely a problem. I remember feeling like you're told that the law is objective, right? And then, you go to criminal procedure, you go to crim law, and you read these cases, and clearly what's happening is racism as it pertains to the court system or the legal system. And in that moment, when you're reading these cases and your professor or no one in the classroom mentions race, you realize this is not at all objective. This is basically, I mean,
mm-hmm.
the law is implemented and written by people who have been socialized in a racist society. And therefore, you see that in our legal systems, in our court decisions, in our processes, in terms of how it gets implemented or how certain people get targeted, or so how the discretion of prosecutors and who gets prosecuted for what. And so, I mean, that's another thing I think, why it's important to have Black female lawyers in academia, in part because I think we come from those experiences, and also like at the very least I try to be thoughtful of how to teach the truth in some ways, like how to more accurately reflect what the law actually says and what it means in practice, particularly for communities of color.
Right. And how and this probably be one of the last questions before we open it up. And you mentioned that, more women, more black women should be in academia, in a legal academia. What are some of the opportunities for that, for advancements of law students? And what is sort of that trajectory? How would a law student go about that?
Well, so it depends to a certain extent. I mean, I guess in some ways my trajectory was a unconventional one, perhaps. And I mean, there are different trajectories, I should say, because that is probably a large part of why there aren't a lot of Black female, professors in legal academia, because a lot of times they look for a very particular set of experiences that get you
Mm,
there. Did you do law review, for example?
mm,
Did you clerk? Who did you clerk for? At what kind of court, or at what level did you clerk? Is it a federal clerkship? I mean, did you clerk for a Supreme Clerk Justice, right? So those types of experiences. How much have you published? More or less, have you practiced at a big law firm? Like those types of experiences, I think a lot of times are maybe like the traditional trajectory to a traditional podium teaching job. And then you would do this thing called going on the market, where you would have to publish something. and then go around and present it to see if someone wanted to hire you. And again, like
Mm,
what's most valued in that space in legal academia is really your scholarship, not necessarily how well you teach, not necessarily have you practiced law a day in your life, but more
right.
so like what have you published and what's your potential for publishing. Clinical teaching is a little bit different in the sense that you definitely have to have practice experience to be a clinical teacher. And so I say I stumbled into clinical teaching, which is true and not true. I decided to take my first clinical teaching job in part because the kind of program that it was, and having being able to kind of combine the things that I love, like community lawyering and trying, some experiences in teaching, which it's funny, you learn more almost teaching than you do anything else. Like
Mm,
when I'm teaching, I have to be intentional about how I approach everything. I think about like how I do things, and not necessarily that there's a right way, but a lot of times I tell my students I learn from them as much as they learn from me, because there's
mhm,
different ways to approach lawyering. And absent a couple of like fundamentals that I'm pretty strict on in terms of client-centered lawyering and making sure that the client has agency and is ultimately making and driving the representation, like there are lots of ways to do the different things that we do as lawyers. But more or less, I stumbled into clinical teaching just by, again, I had a number of years working at a legal services organization doing transactional work, and then took a clinical teaching job. And so there are a number of fellowships and fellowships that are with the idea being that it'll eventually lead you into a clinical teaching job. That was the way that I got in. And typically one of the things that they want to see is just that you have had 3 to 5 years of practice experience prior to like going into one of those. And so that's also another trajectory. And in clinical teaching jobs, they don't care as much about those other things. Did you clerk? Did you do law review? Did you have, how much have you published, and what have you published, or where have you published? Clinical teaching is much more practical in nature.
okay. Thank you. We can open it up to questions now if we have any. Do we have any in the chat box at all? I'm checking the chat box. And if not, you can unmute yourself and you can ask the question. And if we don't have any questions, I do have one last question. um, so what would be the best resources in your opinion for law students who do want to dive deeper into academia and the securities legal space and business and community development?
Yeah, so the thing that worked for me in law school, and maybe even post law school, it wasn't as clear to me that I wanted to do transactional work like as it was to you. I think I'm generally someone who has to try things and then process them. I think one of the things that's most important generally is like to have a practice of reflection. So as you're doing anything, taking time to kind of step back to think about, one, like, does it square with your theory of change to the extent that you went to law school to, change the world, as like a lot of us naive folks did, right? And not to say it's not possible. I'm just saying, like, I'll claim it for myself. I was very naive when I went to law school. Um, and does this square with your theory of change? Is this work that feels meaningful to you, like, and um is this something you could see yourself doing every day? And if it's not, trying something else. And so I always encourage law students to use their experience in law school, their summers, the semesters, whether they can participate in externships or clinics. Definitely take a clinic, but to use their law school experience as an opportunity to try things and to see if it's actually something that feels good and feels right to them in terms of like their practice as they graduate. So that's one thing that they can do. And there are definitely a number of organizations. You obviously can reach out to folks if you have questions or just want to, like, I think one of the best things to do too is just to try to get on someone's calendar and ask for an informational interview. Ask them about the things that they like about their job, the things that they don't like about their job, what the work is actually like how did they get into it, trying to understand different trajectories, as you just asked, about ways in which to get into the work. Look for internships for orgs who do this type of work, or ways in which you can actually participate in this kind of work. And try it. I mean, I think you almost have to do it to see if it's a
Mm-hmm.
good fit, right? And to try to do something that you feel somewhat passionate about. It makes things so much easier. And maybe I'm just one of those people who I can only really commit and do the things that I really care about. So it's hard for me to put my head in places that my heart is not. And so I know that the work that I do has to be somewhat meaningful to me. And that is what motivates me to get up and do it every day, and enjoy it while I'm in the middle of it.
Right. Um, oh, someone does have a question. Hold on, because I was gonna say, how can folks, let's see. The question is, I just wanted to thank Renee for her insights today. I love it when she spoke about community development. Okay, so a compliment, Renee. Not much of a question, but they love you, Renee. Like we all, I feel like it's not hard to love you, Renee. So how can people
No,
get in touch with? Oh, go ahead.
oh no, yeah, well, so how can people get it? They can send me an email and then give me a couple of days to get back to them right now, because there seems to be so much going on. But no, I mean, I really appreciate the opportunity just to talk about this, and the fact that you're doing a series, right? Because I hadn't heard anyone kind of talk about like community development law, or even what that is. And I took a community development law class in law school, and even then I wasn't sure exactly what it is. And I remember at the end of the course being frustrated, and I said, well, one of the reasons why I wanted to take this class is I still don't understand, even after learning all these areas of law, because we talked about housing law, we talked about economic development. I still don't understand, how do you develop a neighborhood without gentrifying and pushing out longtime residents?
Mm,
And that's why I took this class. And so, no, I mean, I really appreciate the opportunity to kind of speak to these issues, particularly in context, like in terms of what the practice looks like, in terms of like at least, the communities that you and I work in. And I think that's probably one of the biggest things, having more opportunities to expose law students, people who want to go to law school, folks who are maybe just starting their practice, and folks who are in practice, to like this area and the opportunities that are in this practice area.
right. No, thank you again. And I like the feelings are mutual. And thank you for joining us, taking the time. And I know you said email is the best way to reach you. What is the best email address for you?
So it's rhatche@uic.edu.
Okay. So
So
I
you
hope
all
folks.
can, if you Google me, you'll find me on our list, or a directory for UIC John Marshall. You can definitely find my landing page, which has all my contact info as well. But it's rhatche@uic.edu.
Okay.
And I
So
guess
there
I'm
you
on
have.
IG. I'm also, I guess, on social media, but I may or may not respond. I'm not really like plugged in that way. But you might be able to catch me on one of those medias.
Yeah,
Um,
you're more in the community, right? Not as virtual as
yeah,
others.
yeah. I'm on Outlook mostly, but
Outlook.
thanks so much for this, Elizabeth. I really appreciate this, and it's just like, it's always just good to have a conversation with you as well.
Oh, thank you. No, likewise. And just to let others know, we'll have another interview series next week, next Friday, with Therese May, who's a Black woman lawyer, but also an investment advisor. And it's going to conclude our democratizing securities legal space, until we open up the second portion, of which we aim to help democratize business capital. So stay tuned, and thank you all for just listening in and to this very important topic as to why Black women matter, and specifically Black women lawyers matter, especially as the Black community go through different transformation and growth and sustainability. So again, thank you, Renee. I look forward to chatting with you even offline, but thank you again for joining us. And again, her email address is one more time.
rhatche uic.edu.
And you can Google her. So if you want to just have a interview or informational interview or a fireside chat, I'm definitely sure that Renee wouldn't mind.
Okay. All right. No, thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. All right. See you later.